Nigerian authorities are currently on a roadshow, Dubai, London, New York, South Africa, trying to attract investors in the energy sector. What opportunities exist at the moment?
Can you come again? I didn't quite get
I'm saying Nigerian authorities are on a roadshow trying to sell Nigeria's opportunities in energy. Tell us about those opportunities.
No, there are a lot of opportunities in the energy sector because first and foremost, Nigeria is still producing only about 2.3 million barrels of oil, while its producibility is about 3 to 3.2 million barrels. There are huge opportunities in the deep offshore. There's gas, and there's also the refining area. There's petrochemicals, significant opportunities in backward integration, and also even in the pipeline and transportation of the products.
Obviously, Bismarck, within the oil and gas sector, many investors have held off making further investments in the sector because of this Petroleum Industry Bill and the kinds of reforms it may introduce. What's the likelihood that the bill will be passed, given so many delays in getting it through and the elections and all sorts of other things interfering with it?
I think it's very difficult or unlikely that it will pass before the elections, principally because of two things. One, the strategic assumptions that were made when the bill was being crafted a couple of years ago have changed. The bargaining position of Nigeria relative to its multinational oil partners and all of that has changed. The pricing assumptions have also changed. Also, the president, the minister, the head of the NNPC, and all the personalities that were involved in this bill have also changed. So, in all fairness, because the circumstances have changed, because the assumptions have changed, because the personalities have also changed, that we need to take another look at the bill, whether to pass it in its form. It was a very ambitious, comprehensive, and holistic bill that made it more difficult to pass and because of their conflicting interests. Maybe it will be broken into pieces, and taken, the fiscal could be taken, the reorganization and restructuring of the NNPC will be taken separately, the host community issues could be taken separately, the local content could be taken separately, and a whole host of the refining policy, the deregulation, so many things are all put together in one bill. So it was a bit ambitious. I think the Nigerian government wanted to take it once and for all and get it going.
How are authorities expecting the industry to change in its complexion, for instance, where a state-run entity is now going to have to be a commercially run entity, deregulation, removing subsidies for consumers is one issue, but also for the oil marketers. How is all of that going to change the financial dynamic?
Well, I think you got to look at it. The oil reform and the power sector reform are kind of related. If you do not deregulate the petroleum product prices, then which forms an input into the power sector, you are not going to have any power sector reform that is sustainable. So what has happened is that they're looking at the gas deregulation, gas pricing. They're looking at diesel pricing and looking at all the other thermal inputs at the same time, so that would drive and make it profitable for those in power to invest, because they now know that the raw materials are deregulated and also the end product, which is the power itself, is also deregulated, and they can price that accordingly. So in the power sector, what you have is a change of the industry structure by way of policy. In the petroleum sector, there's a change of industry structure as well as intervention to ensure that the sector itself is viable and sustainable.
Let's talk about the power sector, because this has created a lot of unease, especially from Nigerian labor movements, for instance. The government's vision is to create an additional 40,000 megawatts feeding into the national grid within 10 years' time. In order for that to happen, there needs to be at least $10 billion worth of spending per annum to try to create the necessary infrastructure. For investors to come in to put up some of the capital required, they need to incur risks and they need a return on investment. When they consider all these kinds of factors, what sort of risks exist for investors?
No, that is why the incentives have been packaged, and the power sector has been broken up, as you know, into the generation, where private sector investors are coming in, the transmission, where it's being concessioned, and the federal government is helping to make sure that there's all the fiscal incentives, the guarantees, and for the bulk purchasing and all of that is taken, and then the distribution itself, which is also being deregulated. So that is what I mean by altering the industry structure from what was essentially a monopoly, a state monopoly, to in one area an oligopoly, in one area a state monopoly run commercially, and the other area where perfect competition. I think it can be achieved. The important thing is that you're not going to have 2,000 megawatts to 40,000 megawatts in one day. Like you said, it's 40,000 megawatts over a 10-year period. Yeah. I think it's achievable. I think they will even get there ahead of time if there's a sincerity in what to do. Now, coming to talk about why the unions and labor are a bit restless. Labor and the unions are restless because the history has shown, and there's enough evidence to show that in the past there's been a lot of waste, a lot of corruption, a lot of inefficiency. So they've heard so many promises, billions have been spent and nothing happened. So obviously they are bound to be skeptical and apprehensive. But once the new approach, which involves private sector inputs and all that, if that is allowed to go on and the leadership is determined to ensure that the interested parties and the vested interests are actually kept out of blocking this process, then it's likely. The point is that if you don't do something about power reform in Nigeria, then you can forget about the economy. So it's a no-brainer. It has to be done, or else it's a game over for Nigeria.
Okay, let's talk about those who may be interested as prospective investors. It's already been said that, for instance, within the power sector reforms, India's SR Group is interested in making a bid. So is the Contour Group of the United States, and I'm sure there will be many other international players.
And the Canadian group as well.
What about local investors? Because in terms of the petroleum sector reforms, the government is adamant that they want to see the fledgling and the burgeoning of indigenous Nigerian companies.
Yes. No, there will be local content in the power sector because there are some special areas where you have targeted the cluster strategy, where you have certain clusters, industrial clusters, where people are actually providing power directly. So first of all, there are some hybrids between local and international investors. There are some which are local investors that are also where technology is being transferred. But the history of local investment in power has not been so good. So for now, the government is keen to see investors, foreign investors who have a track record in the markets where they've operated before, coming to put their money where their mouth is and take advantage of the incentives. I think subsequently down the road, you will find local investors who will be able to respond and compete, one, and two, partner with these international investors to ensure that the power is actually delivered. And
very briefly, it may be early days, Bismarck, but we know that there's the multi-year tariff order. Investors are a bit concerned that as you reconstruct the pricing of electricity and energy, it might mean that they make losses as opposed to gains on their investment.
That is true, but I think the multi-tariff structure is designed to ensure that investors will make profits, because there's no way that any investor is going to even take any loss at any point in time. The history of government promises in the past in Nigeria has not been anything to go by. So now everybody wants to know upfront what the commitment of the government is, what they're going to get, what the internal rate of return is, what the profits are going to be, and all of that. And that, for example, like we were discussing earlier, the question of the brokers being suspended in the stock exchange today. The rules were there, the matters were made clear to everybody that, in fact, it's not an increase in capital, it is an enforcement of the capital rules that were there before. But you see, there has to be consistency between government promises and advocacy and what they do. And that is what has made some investors a bit worried. But now everybody has to be clear from the beginning. Government has to be committed, sincere, and proactive.